Welcome to Standard 9D, or the first part of Standard 9D. This is another one of these standards with a whole lot of information packed into it, so we're going to split this into two parts. In this standard, we're trying to explain the rise of industrial economies and their link to imperialism and nationalism. This is another one of these benchmarks within a standard that I've often thought should be its own standard. Imperialism is a pretty big period of history, but it is very much connected to the Industrial Revolution, and that's why I think the writers of the standards put it here in Standard 9 along with the Industrial Revolution. The word imperialism that we're going to be using a lot in this presentation refers to this period of history really from the mid-1800s through the mid-1900s, roughly a 100-year period, when the industrialized nations of Europe and the United States as well took over large areas of Africa and Asia. And we'll be talking about the reasons why as well as the effects. The first essential question that we're answering in this standard, we'll take a look at the second one in our second part, is why did European countries participate in this practice of imperialism? Why did they go out and conquer these large areas of Africa and Asia in the 18 and 1900s, and what was going on with this race for colonies that existed during this time? To give us a sense of what we're talking about here, we see a map here of colonial claims in the world in the Eastern Hemisphere in 1900. Okay, and we can notice when we look at a map of the world, Europe, it's not that big a place in terms of geographical size. Okay, so the colonial powers are inside this circle. Countries like England, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal. Okay, and we can see in the chart here that these European colonial powers, they control a large amount of land, both in the chart and on the map itself. We can see that in Africa, Asia, and Australia, in all three cases, over 50% of the land is controlled by European powers. It's really only the Americas where Europeans had been kicked out, starting with the American Revolution in the late 1700s, and then the Latin American revolutions we saw in Standard 7, ending with the Monroe Doctrine, which sealed the Western Hemisphere out of control of Europeans. Now the European colonial powers are focused on Africa and Asia, and that's largely due to the Industrial Revolution. As we saw earlier in Standard 9, the Industrial Revolution begins in England and spreads throughout the rest of Europe, and this is going to give it both the technology to spread beyond Europe, but also the needs to spread beyond Europe. Okay, so we're going to see in this presentation the reasons why the Industrial Revolution causes these powers to spread beyond Europe into Africa and Asia. Okay, there's some essential understanding to help us with this question. The first piece is that these industrial nations in Europe, they needed natural resources and they needed new markets to expand their economies. These factories that were developing in Europe, they required a lot of coal, they required iron, copper, all of the natural resources, and Europe in the first part of the Industrial Revolution had enough of these natural resources in the ground in Europe to supply its needs. By the mid-1800s, 100 years into the Industrial Revolution, Europe had pretty much burned through all of its own supply of natural resources, and they needed a new source, and Africa and Asia supplied that need. Also, these factories were producing huge amounts of products, and Europeans could buy some of that, but if the European economies were going to continue to grow, they needed to find new customers, new people to buy these products. And Africa and Asia presented large numbers of people who could buy and use these European products. Okay, we see here, for example, in this chart, when we take out the United States and Japan, we see there on the key at the very bottom, we just focus on the Europeans in this chart, in this graph showing us the share of world manufacturing output, the percent of products in the world being made in Europe. By 1900, that had risen to about 50%. Half the products in the world by 1900 were being produced in Europe. And in order for Europe to continue to grow, they needed both the natural resources and new markets to buy or to sell their products and for people to buy them. Okay, so in order for them to get resources and in order for them to find new markets, these European nations, and again we're talking countries like Germany, England, France, Russia, they're going to compete to control the land in Africa and Asia. And this was really for their own benefit. Okay, imperialism, when you get down to it, it was this need in these nations to secure their own economic and their political success. They felt this need to take over parts of Africa and Asia for their own benefit. Okay, so in terms of the essential knowledge we want to take away from this presentation, our first bit of essential knowledge has to do with the reasons for imperialism. What motivated these European countries? Okay, and the first one, as we mentioned a bit already, was the desire to find natural resources and new markets for trade. Factories such as this, before the Industrial Revolution, they didn't exist. But in order to keep these factories producing products, you needed a large amount of natural resources. And once Europe went through its natural supply of these resources, it really needed to go somewhere else to find them. From the European point of view, there were no factories in Africa and Asia. These natural resources weren't being used. It's not to say it was the right thing to do, but Europe saw itself as justified if Africa and Asia weren't using these products to basically steal them and bring them back to Europe for use in these factories. Okay, Africa, for example, is filled with natural resources, a very wealthy in terms of natural resources, but unfortunately for Africa during this time, the natural resources weren't being used for their benefit, they were being used for the benefit of the Europeans. Same was true for Asia. Okay, and we see in this political cartoon that idea reflected, that if they could, the European colonial powers would have just dug all the ground up in Africa, export all of the natural resources back to Europe. Okay, the second thing we have to understand as a reason was nationalism. Like so much of the 1800s, nationalism was a huge motivator for the Industrial Revolution and for imperialism. Nationalism motivated and inspired European nations to compete for colonies and to get more colonies and build bigger empires. We see in this political cartoon from a British magazine in the late 1800s the lion in Africa, and we see in the background there the British flag. Okay, and we see crossed off in the title what once was German East Africa, it's now a British flag flying over, and that would give a sense of pride in England that East Africa was now British and no longer German. Okay, we see the map of Africa lit up here with all the European countries that controlled it. Really, France and England are going to control the largest empire throughout Africa here. But even little countries like Belgium, nationalism is going to fuel them as well. In a little tiny place like Belgium, who gets pushed around and kind of disrespected during the 1800s by its neighbors like Germany and France, they're going to be able to go to Africa and conquer the Congo, which is almost 80 times bigger than Little Belgium. And that also would inspire pride in a country like Belgium. So this need for national pride was a big cause of imperialism. Okay, and then our last one was this desire to spread European culture, the economic, political, and social philosophies of Europe throughout the world. We see it in pictures like this. Europeans spread their fashion, their clothing to Africa, and we see Africans in this picture taken in the late 1800s in South Africa of people dressed in European fashions. We notice the top hat and the suit or the military uniform and the gentleman seated on the right. Okay, we see Europeans come down to Africa and they establish schools to spread their language. For example, English teachers go to Africa, and one of the largest languages spread throughout Africa and Asia and spoken today is English. Okay, scenes like this, we see people in Africa learning English. Same thing with French, probably the second biggest language throughout Africa and Asia. Originally just spoken in France, but because of imperialism spread throughout Africa. You see the same thing is true for religion. Missionaries from Europe come and spread their religion in Africa. We see here a quote by the Anglican Archbishop of South Africa back in the 1980s, Desmond Tutu, saying basically that the Europeans brought their religion to Africa while the Africans had the land, and it was almost like a trade. Okay, at the end, the Africans had Christianity, the Europeans had the land. Okay, we can see in these charts the effect of this. Going back 100 years to roughly 1900, close to 80% of people in sub-Saharan, the southern part of Africa, practiced traditional African religions. By 2000, we're looking at maybe about 15%. At the same time, traditional African religions are decreasing. Christianity goes from about 10% in 1900 to almost 60% of the population in 2000. Okay, and we see again in this chart here how Christianity goes from being a relatively small, only 1.4% of the population in 1910 to 100 years later, it's 23.6%. One out of every four Christians in the world today in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, the other part we need to know here are the forms of imperialism. Imperialism didn't take the same shape everywhere. The most common was the colony. Okay, so the Europeans established colonies, and these were places, these were territories that were owned and directly controlled by a foreign power. For example, Ghana or the Gold Coast, ruled by the English. The English would appoint a royal governor to rule the day-to-day operation of the country, and he reported directly to the Queen back in England. Okay, so that was a colony, very tight control by the European power. We also had a form called a protectorate. Okay, Uganda in British East Africa was an example of this. In a protectorate, the colonial power allowed the traditional rulers, in this case, whoever the king or the emperor or the ruler was in the area, to remain in power, but they had to follow orders from the colonial power. So again, in the case of Uganda, the ruler still had to respect the wishes of the British Queen. Okay, and then the last form largely found in China was the sphere of influence. And the sphere of influence was the least controlling, the least dominating of these, and it really was an economic arrangement where the territory gave exclusive trading privileges to the foreign power. In these cases here, in the orange area, the English were the only ones who could trade. In the blue area, only Russia could trade. Okay, and that's what a sphere of influence was. Okay, and that concludes the first part of Standard 9D.